And I have a special guest. I'm starting out with a special guest, and you see him right here. He's with me. He's my a dear friend. I've known him for some time, but he lives in Washington D.C. I'm in California, so we don't see each other that frequently. And really, we're not really good friends. Okay, I know him, but no, he is now the curator of the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American section. I know I've butchered your title there. I don't want to
A
demote
little
you,
bit.
promote
Yeah.
you, but here he is, Dr. Theo Gonsalves. Welcome, Theo. This is the week that you've published this new book, APA. What is the official title? APA.
Smithsonian Asian Pacific American History, Art, and Culture in 101 Objects.
See, I know that you probably had to really wrestle which 101 right objects.
Yeah.
I noticed that this is a telltale sign of how good a friendship we have because you did not include anything of my socks that I left behind when I stayed at your place or anything. But this is a why would you consider this book a this is an entree point for a lot of people into Asian
Mm.
American history, right?
Hmm. Well, it could be, and that was the original idea behind the title, was to think about it as APA 101. So it's not just 101 objects or 101 entries, but it's supposed to evoke that classroom setting of like Econ 101, American History 101. So here, APA 101 has that sense of this book as a teaching tool, and it was originally conceived of during the time of the pandemic when I'm working with some colleagues at the Smithsonian, and we're thinking about a number of projects that we still had to continue while we were in lockdown. And this was an idea that, or a version of this idea, was on a shelf someplace, and it was a lot of fun to try to configure this into a book. So from the very beginning, it's existed as kind of like a teaching tool to highlight the Smithsonian's collections concerning Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
And you have all these objects in the collection, right?
Yeah, that was one of the main requirements for the book, was to that by the time of publication, all of these objects are part of the Smithsonian's collection. So overall, the Smithsonian stewards about 175 million objects, so 3D objects that are part of any one of the 21 museums. So I work at the National Museum of American History. We steward about 1.4 million objects or so, and it's not possible to put all these objects on display, but because they're part of the collection, it's part of the public's. It's a public trust to steward these objects for the American public and for the world. The idea here is to focus in on a subset of that. So there have been other books. They're called object books in the Smithsonian's kind of universe, and Smithsonian Books has created, as our publisher, Smithsonian Books has published books on say the Civil War, and we'll think about Civil War related artifacts, women's history. One of my colleagues put together a great book on, and an exhibit on, Latinos in baseball.
Yeah.
So this book kind of comes as part of that tradition of thinking about material culture, actual objects as they relate to history and storytelling.
Yeah, and that's what a museum does too. It collects these things. I mean, when I worked in Washington at NPR, I did a story on the Smithsonian. I went out to one of your warehouses out there,
Mhm.
and it's amazing. It's been described as America's attic, right?
Yeah.
Where all these things that have special meaning are housed, but you may not see them on
That's true.
display. But
Yeah.
it's good to know that they're there, that someone's keeping them, and you don't have to keep them in your own garage or attic. So it's a kind of a special thing. Now, Asian Pacific American, we don't have a museum, do we? Or do we have a section in the Smithsonian? Or I know that's been one of the contentious things in the past, that we deserve a museum. We have things to show and to share with people.
Yeah. Well, there are thousands of objects that relate to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders all throughout the entire collection of the Smithsonian, whether it's at Air and Space or the National Portrait Gallery, Smithsonian American Art Museum, Natural History, American History, where I work. So they're scattered all about. There's not one physical display or gallery that's devoted to this particular group. And if that changes, it will be Congress that can create a new museum, or the Smithsonian can also create another gallery space. But that's um, uh, some of those are in the planning stages. Some are being talked about, and until that happens, then curators like myself and others, and there's probably at least a dozen curators that focus on APA histories throughout the Smithsonian. We'll continue to work on different projects like this and other exhibits or blog posts or other publications and things like that.
And so you're taking the best from what the Smithsonian has, and you're, as you mentioned, you're one of how many APA curators at the Smithsonian?
Well, for this book, I was able to assemble a group of about 20 writers, so 19 writers, including myself. And these would be fellow curators, collections managers, education specialists, program specialists. So people have different areas of expertise that intersect with the telling of APA histories. And so those were the folks that I invited to write specific entries for the book. So we're scattered about, and we're usually in each other's projects, lending a hand here, lending expertise, or even just a few thoughts here and there. But there's a lot of work that takes place, and it's a lively group because there are a lot of really great projects going on.
Yeah, but again, to get it down to 101, it had to be pretty. I know. Was there debate, much argument about, oh, this needs to go in, or this doesn't, or this is really a lot, this is better example of X or Y.
Yeah.
What kind of argument went into winnowing it down to 101?
Well, it wasn't really contentious. I think we started, like a lot of things at the Smithsonian, big or small projects, they all start with a spreadsheet, and you think you have a particular idea and you want to organize objects in this case. And so we started with a curatorial assistant that I've been working with. Her name is Tan Lu at the National Museum of American History. And she was able to assemble an initial survey of about 1,200 objects. And that's when we started checking our work against our fellow colleagues and started asking different people that we knew that had knowledge about different collections, well, what else should go into this? And so there's a way to kind of start, which is a blue sky situation. And there's not one curator that knows everything in the collection. Like I said, there's like 175 million. So it's really, you really do have to depend on a lot of collaboration and the goodwill of folks to help you point out, oh, there's a collection here, there's a smaller archive here. And so we kind of kept things open for a while and then started narrowing things down in terms of geographic distribution, time periods, locations, ethnic groups, and try to figure out the range of diversity that's possible with this it's a very large group, of course, but the things that end up emerging are a lot of overlaps, and then you start to see gaps. So it wasn't contentious. I mean, once you start thinking about the different ways to represent the diversity of APAs, then it becomes quite helpful to bring 1,200 down to 500, down to 200, and then eventually down to 101.
All right. So once you get to 500, from what was the initial startup number? Like
about 1,200 or so.
So from 1,200 to 500, okay, better. Now you get 200. Okay, now you still got to get down to 101. You had to cut some people. Is there one in particular that you wanted to include in the 101 that you didn't, that you think really does check off all the boxes that says, yeah, this needs to be included? Or
well, there's some, I think the short answer to that is yes. There are a lot of objects that didn't make the cut, and I think for a number of reasons could have made the cut in fun and interesting ways. There's certain things that I'm still learning about in the collection. There are, of course, a lot of my fellow colleagues continue to send me notes about stuff that they continue to find, either the more recent things that they're collecting, or just kind of things that they're kind of understanding about their own collections. And then they flag it for me and say, hey, there's this comic book cover that whose design was created by this Korean American illustrator. It's like, it's really great to get those tidbits of information. But there have been lists that go decades back to try to summarize like what's possible in terms of thinking about an APA collection. And some of these lists have gone back to the 90s to try to do is essentially this kind of work of what this book has represented. And they put together well, now it's a PDF, but it was a word processing document that just kind of listed a bunch of objects that were in different Smithsonian collections. And so that was really one of the starting points, is to kind of look at that initial list and to expand on it and then figure out a way to see what works. I think the key thing here is not just that the objects tell a particular history. It's also that we're applying an interpretive frame, an analytic that comes out of Asian American studies, and also Asian American history, as to how to understand the broad arcs of Asian American and Pacific Islander histories. Otherwise, we're just kind of thinking about kind of an ad hoc collection, which was how it was originally developed over so many years. And the key thing here is with this book, our team is applying, really the strengths of what the field has been able to deal with, which is to understand those broad storylines of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders coming to the Americas, and then more specifically the United States.
Well, you do include a timeline. We'll talk about that, when it comes up,
Mhm.
and it's important because it is the historic. It does become the framework for how you view where these things belong.
Mm.
One thing that comes up. Well, let's talk about it now. The Filipino American National Historical Society likes to mention the 1587 incident when Filipinos were part of an explorers group
It's like a landing party. Yeah.
landing from Macau. It was Pedro de Unamuno's ship. He was part of Philip Galley's expeditions. Galley and this guy Unamuno split. Unamuno went to Morro Bay. The Filipinos were the first in the landing party.
Mm-hmm.
The Filipino American National Historical Society makes a big deal about that. I noticed it's not in the timeline. Why is it? Why was that the case? And what is the perspective of the Smithsonian?
Well, I'll speak on behalf of what I wrote for that timeline. We wanted to include a timeline because the rest of the book is not arranged in a chronological fashion, and there is a way to think about presenting all 100 of these objects, and certainly that's one way to do that. Is just kind of look at the date. Well, then we have to look at which date are we thinking about? The date that it was acquired by the Smithsonian, or is it the date that this object was created, the date that it was used? I mean, there are a number of dates when you want to think about how to arrange a chronology. I opted for thinking about the arrangement of the book into different themes or keywords, different kinds of shared experiences over time. So that's why you see it arranged in the way that it is with across 11 chapters. And so as I was talking with our executive editor at Smithsonian Books, one of the ideas was, because the book is not arranged in a chronological fashion, it would help the reader if they could have some kind of historical timeline to kind of hang the histories on. So that way, at whatever part they are in the book, and that's why we try to mention dates and time periods in each of the entries, so that way they can kind of go to that historical timeline and say, okay, here's where we are with that. So to get to your question about why the Morro Bay landing was not in there, there are a lot of other details that had to be attended to, and the larger thing that was important for that part of that story was the fact of the Spanish galleon trade and how that linked the Philippines with China, Mexico, and Spain, which is how you end up getting a landing party like that into Morro Bay. It also, and so we don't have that specific. We also don't have the specific detail of, say, like the first Filipino in Alaska going out to 1787. So there are certain things that, in specific details that might be missing, but we're aiming for like at least a broad story, and hopefully that's covered where you have that kind of experience where Filipinos, or at least Manila, becomes the hub for globalization in 1565 when it's opened, and thereby linking Asia and the Americas and Europe in this kind of global band of transit, and the circulation of goods and people. So, in a sense, that part of the story is there. And because you know this history well, Emil, hopefully you're able to find that story within the larger arc. And so that's one of the things that I've tried to pay attention to, are those kind of larger shared arcs that people might be able to find themselves in.
Well, that's a very good academic and political answer, Theo. But you're
Completely.
right. It's the broader sense. You get where Manila was, and you don't zoom in necessarily like Fonz would with Morro Bay in 1587, but you get this was a fact. This is all right. One could make a case like Amerasia Journal for those logs that showed Indios Luzones, but
Zonas Indios, yeah.
yeah, Luzones Indios, but that's all right. This is part of this is a good book. The APA Smithsonian APA 101 cultural objects that you can take to a bar and you can challenge friends.
Yeah, it's great for trivia night.
Well, but it's more than trivia, right? I mean, as you get into it, you see
Yeah.
these are significant objects, and that's why the 101. Now, before we get into the objects, um, any other boxes that had to be checked to make that 101 list that were mandatory?
Well, this is a bit of a cheat though. So if you go through the book, one of the things that you'll find is that there are 101 entries, but there's actually more than 101 objects. So there are a couple of entries that have more than
Oh,
one object.
ah,
So it's a little bit of a cheat, but that's
no, no,
okay.
no. That's good. I like that. I like.
So if you turn to the entry that focuses on these congressional gold medals
Yeah,
by Asian Pacific American soldiers during World War II, there are three medals that the Smithsonian has, three congressional gold medals. One awarded to the Nisei veterans, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, another awarded to Filipino veterans, and then another awarded to Chinese American veterans.
right.
And so for each of these communities, these are these incredibly important milestones in the history of what it means to tell the story, to be Japanese American, Filipino American, and Chinese American. And so what I wanted to do is, rather than have three different entries, I wanted to bound it up into one entry to make sure that we're thinking about this in a novel way, which is, we often don't get a chance to think about these forms of service in a comparative way in terms of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino, all taking place during World War II. Usually they're isolated, and in many ways, what's interesting is to kind of see how the fates of different Asian American groups were different yet overlapping, distinct, and yet very important. So again, that was one. I think it was a clever way to kind of think about this history that hadn't really been told in a particular way, and I'd love to see more of that take place, because when we think about these wars, it's true that there are some of them are regional, but I mean, we're talking about a global war, and it definitely affected the global experiences of Chinese and Japanese and Filipino Americans during this time. So that's an example where you have more than one. And there are a couple of other entries, like campaign pins. There's like an entry on campaign pins, and there's 4 pins in one entry. And rather than talk about one particular campaign where Asian Americans were part of like a part of an electoral campaign, the idea was to kind of think about, we kind of zoom out a bit and think about Asian American political participation,
Right.
in different kinds of political campaigns over time. So it's a little bit of I cheated a little bit,
No,
Emil.
you didn't cheat, but you did. You were trying to be inclusive, and I think it is. I
Yeah.
mean, that's sort of the goal of a curator, to get as much in, to cram as much in while you're curating, and to find the ways that would justify the rubric you create, and you did. And so,
Yeah.
pat on the back to you, because
Okay.
you mentioned campaign pins, and
Yeah,
then there's Patsy Mink.
that's right.
Because how can you leave out Patsy Mink?
Yeah, exactly. So we have a campaign leaflet. It was I believe it was a re-election campaign leaflet that's featured of hers. We have other objects related to her, and in terms of being a landmark legislator, first Asian American woman in Congress. Um, her entry is really important to talk about, and the back of the leaflet includes all the uh, different areas of her expertise by the time that she had was a member of Congress. And so we have persons like her, and then others like Dalip San Singh, the first Asian American male who served in Congress. There's a portrait of him with a supporter. And so we get a chance to tell these stories about people who've been pioneers in office, and then also others that have participated in politics on the street, in the grassroots. People like Yuri Kochiyama, musician activists like Chrissy Jima and Nobuko Miyamoto, bands in Thailand and in the Philippines that were thinking about politics and community, and their music ends up being used in rallies all around the world, and also in the United States as well. So there's a lot of ways to tell these stories and to kind of remix the entries into different categories and buckets.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a sorter's dream, because you can like try to find ways to be inclusive.
Yeah,
And let's go back for a moment to, because we're coming up to Veterans Day, and those congressional medals.
yeah,
Uh, they're very important to the communities. I'm glad to see them in there.
yeah.
Both the Chinese and the Japanese and the Filipinos got these medals. How significant were these medals to the community? I mean, you get into it a little bit in the writing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's significant not only for the awardees, but then also for the family members themselves, because oftentimes, I think this is true of a lot of different families. It really depends on the vet and whether or not they wanted to be able to share those experiences with their family members. Oftentimes, people grow up with silences about war and the trauma of those wars, and I think especially for family members to recognize that their loved one was recognized in this way, it's a way to acknowledge their service, and to see them in a different light, especially at a time where they might have experienced a range of discriminatory behavior while they were in service or after they came back. So it's quite it can be quite a special thing in a moving experience, and I understand working with people like General Tony Taguba, who continues to work on behalf of Filipino veterans. He has these events around the country where they continue to share the news of the awarding of the Filipino medal to different communities, and it's always quite moving to see the reaction from different audience members and these families. So it's really quite moving, because a lot of those stories can sometimes be undertold.
Yeah. But there's also this idea that people went to war to prove their loyalty to the U.S., to prove
Mm-hmm.
their patriotism. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that was really one of the prime motivators.
Mm-hmm.
And then to have the service, and this is where the history becomes important, because if you were a if you were in the United States and serving in the military, you got you got a medal, but you also got the benefits that were taken away by the Rescission Act of 1946.
Yeah.
It was mostly the Filipinos who were
Mm-hmm.
fighting in the Philippines who were promised
Mm-hmm.
you know, uh, promised pay and citizenship. When that was rescinded in '46, that was the drama of these veterans trying to fight for their equity rights all
That's
through
right.
until 2009.
Yep.
And so there's still like it's kind of confusing, because everyone who served, if you're a Filipino, got the Congressional Gold Medal, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right. It became, with that Rescission Act was a promise that a Filipino fighting on behalf of U.S. forces would be entitled to benefits at the conclusion of World War II. And then Congress has its own set of conversations about cost cutting, and realizing it might be too expensive to award all these benefits to all of these veterans. So there begins a new battle for these vets and their families, how to realize their service, their form of recognition, even though they had they performed that military service. You know, these are such complicated stories, because when you think about when the Japanese military attacks Pearl Harbor in 1941, they were also attacking Manila simultaneously. And I think a lot of people kind of forget, again, it's a global war. It didn't happen just in the United States, but it was an attack on military installations in Hawaii as well as in Manila as a result of the taking of those places by the American military 40 years before that. So it's really quite fascinating to see then what happens to young Filipinos who want to sign up for military service, and when they do so in California, they are ineligible because the Tidings-McDuffie Act had made Filipinos ineligible to citizenship after 1934. Well, it only took less than a month for FDR to be able to turn that around and say, well, you folks have been busboys, you've been factory workers, you've been field workers. How about this? We'll sign you up now finally as soldiers and sailors as well. So now you can fight. I think what's fascinating about this story is that when Filipinos are fighting to liberate their homeland, the question that many of us can ask is, well, what's their homeland? Is it still the Philippines, or is it now their new home in California, where they might have been since the 20s and 30s?
Yeah.
And when you see the insignia patch, what's one of the objects that's included in this collection, you'll see the shoulder sleeve insignia of the Filipino 1st Infantry. You'll see that shoulder sleeve insignia, and all military units have these things. They help to identify one unit from the next. You'll see that the image is an image of a volcano that's erupting. There's 3 stars above. And one thing to ask students of history is, where is this volcano located? For the 1st Filipino Infantry, that's a volcano that's not located in the United States. It's located in the Philippines. So again, this is an interesting question. What was the country that they were fighting for? The 3 stars above represent the 3 island groups of the Philippines, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And it became clear to them that in that patch, who they were fighting for. They were fighting for the liberation of their home country. So again, it's these questions of political loyalty and political obligation and citizenship that continues to inform not only the vets themselves, but also their family members.
Right. And the entire community. I mean, when you think about the Filipinos and FDR turning around and allowing the Filipinos to fight, it was still a segregated army.
Yep.
And it was still, and the Filipinos had to be in their own unit. And, and one of the things that, my father was in that era. He came to America in 28. He was too old to be in the army. But you see how this now just kind of snowballs in the snowballing of history, because my father was not able to go in to serve even after FDR allowed Filipinos to serve. He was too old because he came in, and then he wasn't able to get the GI Bill, which was like the first affirmative action for Filipino Americans to really move into a middle class in America. And so, I mean, when I saw the patch, I saw the Congressional Medal, and then later I saw the patch, and I was, this is another part of history that I think deserves its own little object. So I'm glad you included the patch. So there, because that's a very critical part of Asian American, Filipino American history that it really isn't understood all that well. All right, so let's go to let's go to the objects in general. We've begun talking about the objects in the time I have with you. Your favorite object. If there's 101. I think I have in my mind what your favorite object is. Well, but what is your favorite? Or I'll give you two objects that the author really wants you to focus on for at least a couple of minutes.
Okay. Well, it's difficult to nail down favorite objects. Working at the Smithsonian, it's an honor to work on behalf of the American public, because all of the objects we're hoping to steward are it becomes our responsibility to make sure that all of the objects in the collection are cared for in perpetuity. And so I think it'd be one thing if I were a private collector. You're talking about my private collection, and I could, over a couple of cocktails, I could show you my favorite
Okay.
object.
Next time
Uh,
I'm in DC.
but this is one of the things that's really a great honor to work for, in this particular setting, is that in many ways they all become my favorite, because it's such a heavy responsibility, and some are whimsical, and others are kind of heavy emotionally, and that's just kind of a range of storytelling that's available, because it's quite a lot to take in, the fullness of the humanity of these stories.
Yeah, it is, as I go over the objects, and I thank you for that very, once again, diplomatic political answer, but it's true. It's true. It's like how do you separate your babies, right? Like asking a parent, which is your favorite, right? But I know you have one. But over a drink next time I'm in DC.
You got
But
it.
let's talk about this one that got me. I didn't know about this.
Yeah.
It's called Chinese Argument, and in
Yeah.
that it almost encompasses all of APA history in
Mm.
a lot of way, in an image, in an object.
Mm.
Describe uh, the entry Chinese argument.
Right. So it's a ceramic statue, about 1.5 feet tall, and it's essentially decorative home goods, that was created in the late 1800s. The point of origin for this was in Brooklyn, in I want to say the late 1870s. And what it does is it depicts a young white male atop a kind of like a rural setting, kind of like a tree, and he's got his arm around an eagle. So of course now all of this symbolism comes to light, where the eagle is representative of the United States, and there are two other figures that are part of this statue, the ceramic statue, and one is a young African American male, and the other is a Chinese male, and we can tell that he's Chinese because of this long queue, the long braid that goes down the back, and the other two are fighting to stay atop this figure, and the Chinese male is kind of almost completely underneath the object, and looks like he might be either falling out, or is in the process of doing so. And so it captures a lot of the debates about what was then called the Chinese argument, about what to do with Chinese. And so you have two two competing forces in American culture during the 19th century, moving into the 20th. And on the one hand, while Asian labor is needed for the American workforces in factories and gold mines and farms and whatnot, capital is welcoming Asian labor by the thousands. That is one fact. The Americas would not be possible without the importation of labor from Asia, this labor migration. On the other hand, you have this other competing force, which is nativism, that's trying to drive out persons of Asian descent. And here you could think of Chinese in 1882, 1875 with the Page Act, 1917 with the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, 1924, next year we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act, where Japanese are excluded. And then 1934, when Filipinos are formally excluded. At the same time, the Philippines is giving its independence. So that's really quite a long set that's only just a handful of the federal regulations and immigration laws that were used to formally exclude persons of Asian descent. And yet, at each of those time periods, you have the importation of Asian labor, right? And so, when you talk about your dad coming in 1928, it's most likely due to the fact of Japanese labor being excluded formally in 1924. Filipinos become the next major wave of immigration coming in. It had already been acquired as a territory in 1899. But after 1924, Filipinos are coming by the thousands to the Americas, especially to the West Coast and Hawaii. So it's not an accident that your dad is coming in 1928. Carlos Bolosan is coming around that same time. Larry Itliong, they're coming around in that same time, and many of them are coming in the worst economic times you could think of, in the Depression. But what that does is it shows this one particular object helps to unlock a series of stories that represents this dynamic, this dual dynamic of both inclusion, the need to include Asians as cheap labor, and also the impetus to force exclusion, to force people out because of nativist sentiment.
Yeah, I was fascinated by looking at this sculpture, and you show one that was sculpted by German-born American sculptor Carl L.H. Muller,
Yeah,
and he's brought in by this the company out of Brooklyn, the Smith UPW,
yeah,
uh, based out of Brooklyn, and
mm-hmm.
he's the designer of. I mean, this isn't a sculpture. Well, this is a piece of artwork that I guess can stand alone, but he's the main designer of things. This is a motif that we see in household, dinnerware, tea sets, vases. I
That's
mean,
right. Yeah,
this becomes like it's
home
a
goods,
design, yeah,
knickknacks.
home goods. Yeah, it's a design thing,
Yeah.
and it's kind of racist in a way.
Well, there it's certainly one way to interpret that, which is that what is the audience for this, and particularly what is it that's being said in the piece, and a handful of museums around the country have versions of this ceramic sculpture in their collections. Depending on the curator, how it's interpreted, you can also say that it was sympathetic to Chinese Americans for calling out the plight that they were experiencing. Yeah, a lot of that is left to interpretation of curators in different collections, and we're thinking about this in the larger history of exclusion and labor migration. So part of this, it can't be answered one way or another, but one way to think about it is to kind of always consider the context in which these objects were created.
Well, I mean, I said maybe it was racist. I mean, I
Yeah,
might have been more definitive than that in the last minute or so when
well,
I.
it's possible. It's
But
certainly possible. Yeah,
I had never heard of this, this thing where Muller's work as a design for
yeah.
dishes and vases and teaware and that kind of thing, and it just but it's almost like a if that were the case and people were buying this, how many people really understood what they were getting?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, I got a nice tea set. Oh, here's a white guy and an eagle, and here's a Chinese guy being being
Thrown
subjugated.
out of a nest. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's almost like uh, the idea of black notions,
Mhm.
African American, pickaninnies
Mhm.
in on the fringes of artwork and things like that. It's almost like, boy, I didn't know that this existed for us, for Asian
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah.
And
Oh no, there were toys that depict. I mean, there are a couple of other examples of toys in the museum's collection that pertain to the need to exclude Chinese. One is a cap pistol, where on the barrel of the pistol is a Chinese male, kind of. It looks like as if he's walking the plank, really, but he's walking along the barrel of a gun, and then on the cocking the pistol itself is are inscriptions that the Chinese must go. And so there's a whole range of objects that involve toys. Certainly, you'll see this in political cartoons, but the material culture also exists for anti-Asian sentiments.
yeah, well, I'll tell you, it opened my eyes when I saw a Chinese argument. I saw the ceramic, and I said, "What is this?" And it's just fascinating. Once again, what got me was how it opened up all these entrees into this rich history that
Mm-hmm.
that begins with Chinese exclusion, then goes to Japanese exclusion, Filipino exclusion,
South
uh,
Asian.
South Asian,
Yeah.
the 1924 Immigration Act, which was the most that implemented all those racist quotas.
Mm-hmm.
It was it. You open up, it's the Pandora's box, as it were, of all
Mm-hmm.
this history, and. So kudos again for picking Chinese art, but there was no doubt that would be included, right?
Well, there's a question as to how much you want to lean into or emphasize those kinds of depictions. I mean, sadly, it's possible to create an entire book, whole volumes of these kinds of images, whether it's propaganda posters during war. A lot of times, people are dehumanized during wartime, and you see that certainly through most of the 20th century, where Asian countries are the battlegrounds for other people's wars, and the visual imagery is really quite striking in terms of how to depict the enemy. And you're always the tactic is to dehumanize them, to make them, to animalize them, to remove their humanity. And so there are vivid examples of this in the collection. So it shouldn't come as any surprise.
Yeah, and it's a tactic that continues to be used, dehumanizing, demonizing. It's in all forms of rhetoric,
Yeah.
political, otherwise. So, one thing that comes up, an object that comes up after the ceramic Chinese argument, is the St. Louis World's Fair pamphlets, and this also, and I guess this is the curator's touch. We're coming up to the 100, and I guess it would be the 25th or something like that. Uh,
Yeah.
of the 1904 World's Fair next year. These
Mhm.
pamphlets are really so. Well, first of all, people probably don't know much about the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and
Sure.
now it has to do with Asian Pacific Americans. But tell us about the pamphlets, because I know about the pamphlets.
Yeah. Well, the World's Fairs are these large spectacles. They're partly entertainment, but then also another way to reveal scientific progress, especially after World War II. I'm sorry, especially after the conclusion of the U.S. Philippine War in 1902, the formal one in 1902. You have the contracting of 1,200 Filipinos from the Philippines, from the Cordillera region, to come to St. Louis to perform. So they were contracted performers, um, and they were there to enact rituals of all types. And some were requested to perform, and it was emphasized. They were emphasizing these so-called primitive rituals, whereas different members of the Philippines were emphasizing their ability to be in a school setting, or others as members of a constabulary band and part of a marching group, and all of that was fashioned as a kind of narrative, from so-called savages to militarized and synchronized performance, in order to demonstrate that the Philippines was safe for investment, right? And so
Yeah,
when
investment and our colonization.
right, and so when you're and these are revealed in the notes of the fair organizers, who were also Smithsonian staff as well, and the ambition was to make that kind of a claim, that even though the the United States was engaged in a brutal war of suppression in the Philippines, that now it was safe for investment, whether you were a cocoa producer or sugar producer or rice planter or whatnot. And so the fairs become part of this large tradition that comes out of Europe, where the spectacle is realized, and a kind of a celebration of of what can be collected, and the progress, that so-called progress, that can be made, oftentimes at the expense of indigenous native peoples. And so that's what's presented in the Philippines. I mean, in the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904, the largest aspect of that fair, the largest segment of that fair, was an 80-acre reservation, the Philippine reservation, and it was the most popular part of the entertainment of the fair. And this pamphlet is specifically about that Philippine reservation, and so it demonstrates what's available, and it puts Philippine bodies into this kind of spectacle that ranges from the so-called savage to the militarized.
Right. And, it's been called, is it too provocative to, you know, is it inaccurate to call it a human zoo? Because they're on display, these Filipinos, and some of them were, in loincloths. They were presented as headhunters. They had gongs like the one behind me.
Sure.
They they were there to say, hey, these are the people, but they're worthy of our 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 money, our colonization, our capitalism.
Yeah.
Is
Or
human zoo
investment.
too? Yeah, or investment. Is
Yeah.
human zoo too harsh?
Well, it's certainly what was used as a proper term. I mean, you think about an enclosure where people are asked to perform and to be on display. Those 1,200 persons, and it ranges from men and women to children,
Yeah,
to enact those kinds of rituals um, on a schedule. And I think, and you'll see are some of the notes by some of those that were interviewed at the fair, and how they thought it was really kind of odd that some of their religious rituals were being taken out of context and performed at a certain time, which it didn't make sense in terms of how it was usually done. But here it was something that was expected because they were merely performing it. And so Human Zoo is not that far off in terms of thinking about how to understand it. It was part of what was then celebrated as the Midway, and the Chicago Fair of 1893. Other fairs in San Francisco or in Buffalo had what was the Midway, not just the scientific presentations in these large pavilions, but also the kind of like the what was called these freak shows. The contortionists, the circus performers, the people who are providing outlandish depictions of human behavior, and you could charge, you could actually pay for some of this outlandish behavior a quarter or a nickel at a time. And so, when people are coming together to see this for the first time, they're probably seeing Filipinos for the first time in their life.
right. And I remember it was in St. Louis, and when I lived in St. Louis, there was a
I didn't know that.
yeah. I went to WashU for grad school, and
Oh,
which is the site of a part of the site of the 1904
that's right.
World's Fair. And so it's ironic. And then a guy whose family was from near there, Clayton, said, "Oh yeah, well, I went to a junior high, and our mascot was the Igorots,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is the mascotry that Native Americans face. And here it was when the Filipinos were brought to St. Louis.
Yeah,
That's what was a legacy of the World's Fair."
yeah. One of the many native groups that were brought over.
Yeah. So anyway, I remember being on eBay trying to bid for a pamphlet, and I bet you I was outbid by a darn
A
Smithsonian
Smithsonian
curator.
curator. Maybe.
I hope not. I gave up. I said, "Oh, I'll just take a snapshot of this." But yeah, the pamphlets are in there. There's so many other things, and our time is short. But you know, you have some key figures. You mentioned um, Yuri before Koshiyama.
Kuchiyama, yeah.
Yeah, and she was she was important. Then right there next to Fred Korematsu, side by side, essentially in the book.
Hmm.
They, you had to have them in the book, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, these larger stories of people who were challenging authority, and in one case of Fred Korematsu challenging the evacuation orders and the curfews during internment, right up to the Supreme Court case, and then of course later in life also challenging um, unlawful detentions of Muslims as he was a kind of a senior figure in the Asian American movement. Yuri Kochiyama, of course, a legendary figure, an activist, along with her husband Bill Kochiyama, based out of New York City. The photo that we have was shot by another legend by the name of Corky Lee, who passed away
Oh,
recently. And so it was again another way to highlight two people in one entry, not only Yuri but also Corky, as a Chinese American activist photographer who was able to document a lot of the Asian American movement through his lenses. And so um, um, that kind of political participation taking place on the street, and you could see her striking on behalf of Chinese waiters in New York City.
yeah. I mean, I thought that those two certainly, and then I didn't know the photograph that you showed was taken by a dear friend, Corky Lee, the
Yeah,
late. lament Corky Lee. Uh, we have a few more minutes, and let me just the depth and the Asian Pacific American, such a broad group, but you include Balbir Singh Sodhi, because a lot of people may be more aware of Asian Americans because of the violence toward Asian Americans,
Right.
but maybe people may not have heard of Balbir Singh Sodhi, and he's there, and it's important that he's there. Why did you include him?
Well, his turban was donated by the family, and this was a Sikh American business owner who was killed in most likely the first hate crime in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. The person who killed him was incensed that so-called Muslims were taking over and that they deserved punishment by death, and unfortunately, Sodi perished in that violent manner. It was deliberate on our part to feature a different version of Sodi. In the book, he's featured holding up his nephew, and it really does kind of encapsulate his story of coming to the United States, coming to Phoenix, Arizona, opening up a business, taking care of his community, being embraced by the local community. A lot of kids loved hanging out with him because he was handing out candy. He was a man of peace and supported his family members. So we wanted to be able to tell a fuller story of who this person was, and at the same time talking about the tragic chapter of anti-Asian violence.
Yeah, you also talk about how his family has responded, and it was on the occasion of the killing of 10 black people in Buffalo that one of his family members wrote about Balbir's death and put it into context. And he wrote this line that got to me, and it's included in your writing. You say, "We must acknowledge that white supremacy is a horrible disease that keeps spreading from generation to generation."
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, you wrote it. Why? I mean,
Recited, yeah, that was recited by his brother, Sodi's brother. So imagine what it's like to live with the tragedy of your sibling's death, and understanding what that has been as a storyline to the nation and not just your family. Now your grief is shared by untold millions, and it's a story that has primarily been authored in terms of white supremacy. And here is one person who has direct knowledge of the of the consequences of white supremacy violence, and it's a powerful statement about wanting to break cycles of violence, to call out the tragedy of that violence, but then also hoping that he can be a place where that cycle can stop. So I found it a really a powerful statement to include, again, to tell a fuller story of not only Sodi, the original person who was killed, but also his family and community and how they reckon with the tragedy of his death.
and then, because violence seems to be the thing that a lot of people associate with Asian Americans since the pandemic because of the rise in crime. Uh, you do include under the chapter Resistance and Solidarity. There's a sign of Chinese Asian Americans in front of looks like Chinatown. Fight the virus, not the people. These kind of this rise in solidarity in the community in the
Mm-hmm.
light of violence. Tell
Right.
me about that photo and why you included it.
Well, that photo was it's part of a banner that I collected for the museum a couple of years ago, and that represents a story of a community in the city, with an organization, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, which was founded in 1882. So, for the history buffs out there, they'll know that that's quite significant in terms of the same year of the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So, this is a group that has had a long history with violence, a long reckoning with violence, and being blamed for a number of things, including diseases, by public health officials. And so, what was prescient about that is that photo was taken on February 29th, 2020. That's just 11 days before the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus a global pandemic. It was as if they could predict the future, but Emil, they couldn't. No one can predict the future. They understood how to meet the present by acknowledging the power of their past, and so they could anticipate what was going to take place. And again, this is part of that story of solidarity and of resistance, because if tragedy and violence is the only story, it can't be the first and it can't be the last story. And so it has to be placed in a certain context. And one of the contexts for thinking about anti-Asian violence is also how Asian Americans have responded to that violence. They have responded directly to it with nonviolent direct action in this case. And so it's part of a very long tradition of what it means to confront that violence and not to shrink from it.
Yeah, Theo, I know we've got to go, but I really appreciate uh, talking to you about this, and I imagine because there are happy images too in the book that you include that we don't have time to get into now, but maybe we'll have you back, and maybe
Sure.
you'll have a second book, right? The second volume
Let's
of
see.
other images. You said you had what? How many Asian? Oh, here's one thing.
Yeah.
You use the term, and the Smithsonian uses Asian Pacific American.
Yeah.
And I think I was working at up on the hill with then Congressman Mineta when they they were trying to figure out, do we call it Asian Pacific America? Do we call it AAPI? Do we call it Asian American? What about the Pacific? And now they've got the Asian Pacific American
Native Hawaiian,
Hawaiian, yeah,
Pacific Islander. Yeah.
yeah, Anna Nippy, I think. Anyway, we've gone through all these different,
Yeah.
you know, uh, permutations of how to describe us.
Yeah.
I guess is this kind of like a legacy thing, Asian Pacific American? Because I'll tell you, I think Asian American is kind of like it's sort of like the first one, but then you got if you include Asian Pacific, everyone's included
Yeah.
as they are in your book. Is that what we're sticking with, Asian Pacific American? What do you think?
Well, it's a good question. And I think when we think about other communities, whether it's African American, Chicano, Latino, all of these Native American, all of these communities have offered different iterations, have offered different names for themselves over time, including Asian Americans, including Filipino Americans. So all of this is to say that that identities and the way to experience the fullness of the humanity of the communities that we're dealing with, it really can't be encapsulated with one particular term. I use Asian Pacific American because in my particular institution, we have an Asian Pacific American Center. But if you look around, NYU's Asian American Studies department is called the Asian Pacific American Center. There, it's used quite commonly. And in the end, when we get into the individual stories, there are specificities to how people want to refer to themselves, and so we try to honor that. At the same time, understanding that all of these are iterations of people trying to describe the fullness of their humanity.
And that's the important thing. All right, I know one last question.
Sure.
Filipina/O, which is something that I think I first saw it when our dear friend Don Mabalan, the late historian, I used in her book. I use it on a couple of things, but then you also use Filipino sometimes.
Yep.
Once again, you're the editor and author. What the style decision was whatever people wanted. I mean, that's what sort of the U.S. Census is.
Well, yeah. I mean, one thing to pay attention to is how people represent themselves, how they present themselves, and we try to respect that. If there's a particular way that they've chosen to do so, then we'll reproduce that. The way that it is now being iterated among a new generation involves not just the rejection of A or O, but also the embracing of X. So in many ways, when we think about how Malcolm X chose his name, it was he thought it to be a temporary name until we find personal liberation toward, again, the fullness of what it means to be Black and American. So he eventually landed on another name, but the X it can represent transition, it can represent a sense of inclusivity. And again, it's young people telling us about the ground of their comfort. And we embrace all of these as parts of ways to describe, again, the fullness of all these experiences.
So Philippinx or Philippinx, Philippine. How do they say it?
Philippinx.
Philippinx. I
Yeah.
see. Okay. I mean I can get into that. And one last question, since we're going to the A, O, and the X, gender and sexuality. I in my going through the book, I didn't see anything that, or I nothing struck me as addressing that, or did I miss something?
Well, again, it's a lot of these stories are embedded in the narratives themselves, how people choose to represent themselves. I think you'll find people that have represent a range of identifications with the presentation of their sexuality. So that's certainly in the book as well.
Yeah. Any one thing that you can point to in terms of an object? Um, I don't know, like if it were an LGBTQ thing, you'd have to have something about Stonewall. But
Hmm.
is there anything like that here? A go-go dancer, Filipino.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's anything as explicit as that. I mean, there are persons who would identify themselves as queer or non-binary who are part of the the fabric of the book itself, and their stories are definitely part of part of the entries.
Yeah. All right. And then, all right. I'm trying. I'm like you, trying to squeeze in 1,200 into 101 spaces.
Okay,
But the timeline. Just one last thing on the time.
sure.
It's important. It's important that people know that this isn't just objects, that there's a timeline there, and this isn't just a coffee table book. It's a history book,
Yeah,
and people can see the history, and it's important.
yeah, yeah. Again, the timeline was important to include just because of giving people a sense of grounding for the reading experience, so they could thumb to it and then refer back otherwise. There's also a set of suggested readings as well, so that way people can familiarize themselves with more of this material.
Well, Theo Gonsalves, the editor, author of many of the sections within the new book, Smithsonian Asian Pacific American History, Art, and Culture in 101 Objects. It's not easy to talk about all 101, so I think we talked about 10 of them or so. But, you know, I want to have you back to talk more about maybe, like one thing in particular, or,
Sure,
one object in particular. And the Smithsonian will let you come if we plug the book.
sure, of course.
Yeah.
I'll make sure I'll have better lighting for the next segment.
That's all right. That's all right. I mean, it makes, gives it that antiquated, well, you're in Washington. Well, okay. Hey, listen, Theo, thank you
Yeah,
really very much for this. I
thanks,
appreciate
Emil.
it. And, I will probably play it shortly.
Okay,
So we're, uh, I'm Emil Guillermo. He's my good, he's my good friend, Theo Gonsalves, who is, what is your title? I don't want to like demote you or give you an inadvertent promotion.
I'm curator of Asian Pacific American history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
So you're the APA curator there, but there are a number of APA curators at the Smithsonian,
Yeah,
correct?
I'm one of two in the building, and then there are others around the campus.
So if you have an object that you want Theo to include in his next book, you can send it to. No, no. I guess you don't want people sending you stuff.
Not to me personally, no.
Yeah, don't send it to Theo personally, but get the book, Smithsonian Asian Pacific American History, Art, and Culture in 101 Objects. Theo, please take care of yourself. Thank you. Good luck on the book.
Thanks, I appreciate it, Emil. It's great talking to you.
Yeah, great talking to you. All right, Theo, hold on a second here. Oh, there. Oh, yeah, there. All right, there. Oh, Theo, I can't. I have to keep you on if I want to talk to you. So I will say goodbye,
Okay.
and I'll talk to you again soon. Take care, Theo.
All right, man. Take care. It's good.
All right, there it is. Theo Gonsalves, my good friend. We'll get this up on Emil Amok's Takeout. Um, maybe I'll replay it all this weekend. How about that? As because this is an important book. Smithsonian Asian Pacific American History, Art, and Culture in 101 Objects. I'm Emil Guillermo. My takeout is on Monday through Friday, usually live at 2 p.m. Pacific. You can get us on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. You can get us on Facebook at fb.com/EmilGuillermo.media. You can also catch it on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Emil Amok. The live show coming up at 2 p.m. if it's Monday through Friday. And then we'll just sort of maybe do this special with the Smithsonian's Theo Gonsalves all through the weekend. Anyway, Emil here. Till next time. Mahal Kita.